Welcome, friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, unwinding after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet companion, you've found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Perhaps you're wrapped in a blanket sitting by a softly lit window or resting somewhere under an open sky. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, comfortable and ready to wander with me into a quiet chapter of the solar system's story, an interstellar comet arriving from the deep between stars. If you find peace or curiosity in these gentle stories, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a moment of stillness too. And to those who have already joined along, thank you. The night is steady. The planet turns without urgency. In that stillness, instruments sweep the sky in patient sequences, taking short breaths of light, then comparing them to the breaths from the night before. Against the great field of fixed stars, a single point shifts its position by a narrow step, then another, a faint motion written on darkness. It is small, only a smudge at first, but consistent enough that mathematicians lean in. They fit a curve to the steps, and the curve refuses to close. The shape opens a hyperbola rather than an ellipse, the unmistakable script of something not bound to the sun. A visitor from outside the family arrives without ceremony, gliding on a path determined long ago by other gravities. He observes that the fact is simple, and accepted an object with eccentricity greater than one is unbound, a traveller rather than a resident, a leaf crossing a pond rather than a fish circling within it. The numbers are gentle, not dramatic, but they carry consequence. With each observation, uncertainties contract. The radial dust thickens a little. The photometry warms by small degrees. A coma begins to gather like breath on glass, a delicate envelope around a nucleus that remains hidden, a compact stone of ices, dust and void sealed for an age. In the low light of a distant approach, jets may whisper from shaded fissures, as sunlight awakens different volatiles at different depths. The process is ordinary. Comet science, insulation, increases ices, sublimate, gas, drags grains free. A halo expands into space and momentum, writes a tale that points away from the sun along lines laid out by the solar wind. It is planetary housekeeping played in microcosm ice, turning to gas, pushing dust, bending light. He notes a quiet, lesser-known detail tucked inside the data worker. The fit to the sky motion does not come from any single night, but from a tapestry of nights stitched together by clocks so steady they correct even for the Earth's own gentle sway, for the wobble of refraction, for the tiny irregularities that would blur a path as thin as the one this object draws. The surveys breathe in 4 measured filters. The calibrations tie to catalogues layered over decades. The certainty emerges not from brightness but from patience. It is late in the year, and the plane of Earth's orbit tilts the geometry so that the new path crosses our system on a steep angle. The tilt serves as a kindness. It keeps the visitor far from the densest lanes of planets and their debris, a clean traverse through the inner heliosphere, quick by cosmic standards, hurried by human rhythms. Only took millions of years to arrive, he thinks, and yet it spends a few months in our reliable sky. Only crosses a few astronomical units, and yet it embodies distances that sap numbers of their meaning. Only grazes our light, and yet it carries histories of other suns in each grain that lifts from its surface. Telescopes that live under domes of salt-white concrete ratchet slowly. Operators listen to weather watch humidity count stars in test frames to judge transparency. A schedule yields to the night short exposures in a cadence designed for motion. The images show a coma slightly asymmetric, a hint of tail, a centroid not quite stellar. Instruments split the light and rebalance it into colours our eyes cannot separate. Unaided bands associated with carbon-bearing gases, with dust grains that have been rounded by endless quiet collisions, with ionized fragments coaxed into line by the sun's wind. There is no drama in the lines, only clarity. The comet behaves like a comet. It is not metallic, it is not exotic. It is an ice and dust body whose chemistry has been shaped by a birthplace beyond a frost line somewhere cold enough for volatile molecules to remain intact, somewhere gentle enough for pebbles to grow into rubble, then into fragments big enough to be thrown. And it has been thrown. Long ago, in another system whose name we do not know, giant planets formed and rearranged themselves, and their rearrangement was not quiet. Gravity works slowly, then suddenly. An encounter lifted this body's energy just enough to escape its natal star. It left with a small surplus of speed, the tiniest margin, that over a million-year drift through spiral arms and interarm darkness becomes the difference between returning and never returning. He allows a soft, dry observation to settle here. They call it a visitor, but it does not visit. It simply passes through a volume of space that happens to contain the sun. Another follows without haste. They call it newly discovered, but its material condenses in epochs before Earth knows continents. A third arrives like a quiet echo. They speak of its path as if it chooses, but the curve is set by sums of forces that care nothing for choice. The heliosphere accepts the traveller with no ceremony. At its boundary, where the solar wind slackens against the interstellar medium atoms, and fields reshape around a moving irregular seed, neutral gas streams become ion tails. Charged particles pick up and spiral along magnetic lines like invisible threads. In solar wind coordinates the comet is a minor imperfection, yet in our narrative it is a teaching point, a natural probe of the sun's breath and of ices that formed far away. Spectroscopists measure isotope ratios that whisper of temperatures at formation of the nursery's radiation of the lengths of time certain molecules have been locked away. The measurements do not answer what star shines in its memory. They do not say from which spiral segment the ejection occurred. They do not resolve the nucleus shape hidden within the coma's veil. Mystery remains and is not a failure. It is a boundary drawn by available photons and the geometry of glare near the sun. He lets that boundary stand. The Milky Way lies like a dim river beyond, and the comet crosses its starfields almost imperceptibly. Against that river it is smaller than language implies, smaller than the breath it triggers in detectors. The hyperbolic excess speed is not dramatic. It is enough. Enough to certify its interstellar origin, enough to ensure it will not bind to the sun, enough to carry it back outwards after perihelion into a darkness that does not end. The planets keep their lanes. The dust keeps its orbits. Earth turns through nights when the object is below the horizon, and nights when it rises before dawn. There is no urgency anywhere in this picture. There is only light warming ice, gas lifting dust, and motion writing a path across a sky that forgets. He returns to the present tense because that is where the comet lives. For us, it approaches now, it brightens now, it teaches now. It is a small calm proof that formation and loss, heating and cooling, accretion and ejection all happen in countless other places. A traveller arrives, and in doing so it says that planetary systems are efficient at making and discarding, that disks are not closed loops, but open workshops, that the space between stars is not empty of stories, only quiet about them. Like a planetary exhale, the coma grows and thins with distance, a breathing cycle in slow motion written in ice and sunlight. The section rests here on a fact that requires no embellishment. An unbound orbit means it comes from beyond and will return beyond. The ironies settle like dust, their edges rounded by time. The mystery remains a small stone in a larger river carried where the gradient allows. The night holds. The planet turns. The visitor continues. He stays with the curve because the curve explains almost everything. The object moves through sunlight on a hyperbola, an open conic that never returns its eccentricity greater than 1, and its far arms leaning towards the avenues between stars. Orbital elements arrange themselves with unhurried precision, an inclination steep against the ecliptic, a longitude of ascending node that sets where the path crosses Earth's plane, an argument of perihelion that places the point of closest approach within the quiet geometry of longitudes, a perihelion distance small enough to wake ices without tearing them away, and a modest hyperbolic excess speed that certifies what matters most, that gravity here bends, but does not bind. The sky plane motion appears retrograde, a slow drift against the eastward procession that planets teach to beginners, and the steep tilt is a kindness because it keeps the traveller clear of heavy lanes where perturbations grow. He notes the accepted fact at the heart of this section and lets it stand without flourish for a body moving under solar gravity alone. An eccentricity above one is the signature of escape. The numbers do not shout, they whisper a conclusion already present in the first curve fit. As more nights add points to the arc, the error ellipses compress, the residuals even out, and the hyperbola remains. Nothing dramatic happens. The mathematics simply breathes and settles. A lesser-known detail follows in a small, careful sentence the orbits published, for such bodies arrive in both heliocentric and barycentric flavours, and only the latter measured relative to the centre of the mass of the solar system tells the long story cleanly, far from Jupiter's tug and Earth's seasonal vantage. In that barycentric frame, the inbound and outbound speeds match within uncertainties a symmetry that comforts the patient reader. He lingers on the slow mechanics. Light time corrections place each measurement where the comet was when its photons left, not where it is when they arrive. Atmospheric refraction bows star images by subarc seconds that are modelled away. Detectors carry distortions calibrated with star catalogues whose own motions have been updated against decades of parallax and proper motion. The path is thin, the uncertainties correlated, the covariance matrix, a quiet map of how changes in one element require changes in another to keep the data whole. It is not a single number of certainty, but a small shrinking shape in a small space. Only took a few hundred well-measured points to rescue the orbit from doubt, he thinks, although the comet has been travelling for millions of years. Only needed a handful of parameters to describe an arc that spans interstellar gulfs. Only required patient subtraction of the Earth's own motions to reveal a motion that cares nothing for Earth. The curve itself teaches what the night will show. Before perihelion, the object accelerates in the sun's field. After it decelerates by the same rule, counted backward a reversible script written in 6 classical elements, and a mass that does not need to be named. Gravitational focusing bends the path without claiming it. The tail, governed by solar wind and radiation pressure, points away from the sun regardless of direction of travel, while heavier dust lingers along the chord. The nucleus takes a soft paradox that looks like contradiction but isn't. On charts, the track cuts across constellations that do not belong to it, and plotting ephemeridalises feels like tracing a temporary river over a permanent map. Navigation tables present right ascension and declination with uncertainties, and the small drift of those values night by night becomes the visible face of a much larger invisible calculus. He allows the mathematics to remain a landscape rather than a proof. The Laplace-Runge length vector would point toward perihelion, a quiet arrow naming orientation in space. The specific orbital energy stays positive throughout a simple inequality that says the sun will not keep what it bends. The sun is a focus, not a centre for this visitor. That is the geometry, that is the mood. Nearer the sun, the curve meets small forces that do not break it but make it speak. Sublimating gases push as jets from shaded fissures, non-gravitational accelerations too slight for a casual eye, yet strong enough to move the time of perihelion by minutes and the distance by fractions that instruments can taste. Analysts fold these whispers into a standard sublimation law that approximates how water, carbon monoxide, and other volatiles turn to gas with temperature. The law is a convenience, the physics a textured field of pores, grains, and sunlight angles. If the nucleus rotates, if it is elongated, if certain regions warm and cool out of phase with the orbit, then the tiny thrusts beat with a rhythm that hides inside the residuals until enough nights reveal it. The mystery is ordinary and durable. The precise rotation, state and shape of the nucleus remain veiled by the coma and the glare of perihelion, and what little is known emerges from how the curve must flex to fit the light we have. He leaves that boundary visible because the script prefers honesty to completeness. The inclination and node together mark a plane the comet refuses to share with the planets, and that refusal is a gift to inference. Fewer close approaches mean fewer tugs to model, and the inbound asymptote can be carried back into the galaxy, with only gentle corrections for the sun's own motion through the local standard of rest. The outbound asymptote can be carried forward the same way a line, not to a destination, but to a direction. In this, the hyperbola is less an exit than a sentence still in progress. He takes a moment to breathe the analogies he allows himself. The path is like a skater's shallow curve, traced on a frozen lake, written by leaning rather than by will. The comet's passage through sunlight is like a planetary exhale in miniature ice-warmed gas, released momentum, balanced, while the conservation of energy is the low music that keeps the choreography calm. He returns to the dry observations that close the distance between numbers and quiet. They call it retrograde, yet it obeys the same gravity as everything that moves prograde. Direction is only a choice of angle. They call it unbound, yet the curve shows how thoroughly it is governed at every instant. Freedom here is only the sum of forces staying positive. They call perihelion a closest point, yet nothing touches. Even at minimum distance, the space between the comet and the sun is a gulf that light crosses in minutes and matter never crosses at all. Sunlight, impartial as ever, lays pressure on dust and torque on ions. The heliosphere's magnetic field whispers alignment into an ion tail that cares more about fields than about mass, while radiation pressure sorts grain sizes into a slow fan of pale arcs that widen with time. None of this alters the fact that the nucleus, the weight at the centre of the coma, rides a nearly perfect two-body path with small knowable deviations. The more the coma breathes, the more the orbit solution learns. The more the orbit learns, the more the coma's breathing can be separated into chemistry and geometry. Slowly the covariance shrinks again. Slowly uncertainties leave. Slowly the curve tightens around a solution that says nothing surprising and everything important. He allows the section to rest where the geometry becomes feeling without ceasing to be geometry. A traveller threads the inner system on a retrograde high-inclination hyperbolic path. The sun bends it and releases it. The planets turn but do not beckon. The numbers placed one beside another complete a sentence that needs no adornment. The object is from elsewhere and will remain from elsewhere, even as it shares our light for a little while, and writes with the simplest of mathematics a soft arc through the bright of day and the long of night. He watches the first breath become a weather, because near the orbit of Mars, sunlight turns from suggestion into command. Insolation rises, the surface warms by slow degrees, and ices begin to leave solid in favour of gas with a steadiness that asks for no drama. Water ice, stubborn at great distance, yields more readily inside 3 astronomical units. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide looser molecules have been whispering from shadowed pores even farther out. Together they make a draft through a labyrinth of grain packings and voids, and the draft becomes a flow, and the flow becomes a coma. The accepted fact sits at the centre like a modest stone when volatile ices sublimate escaping gas entrains dust, and forms an expanding atmosphere whose density falls roughly as the inverse square of distance from the nucleus. That is the hazer picture, simple enough to teach and good enough to fit, and it turns the invisibility of gas into a profile instruments can weigh. The coma thickens as if exhaled, and dust grains once locked among neighbours slip free with the help of that gas drag. Some are so fine that radiation pressure rivaling solar's gravity written, as a quiet ratio called beta, bends their paths outward into soft fans. Some are coarse enough to lag along the cord, the nucleus traces lingering like a wake in still water. Jets awaken where sunlight crosses edges on the rotating surface, and those jets are not fireworks but veils, persistent and directional, laying faint fans that widen with distance. Geometry writes their signatures. As the phase angle grows forward scattering, brightens the dust by a factor that is more mood than flash, a subtle lift that observers find with photometry and then set aside with a correction because modelling requires a flat table. A lesser known detail lives in that correction dust in Comets, often shows a negative polarization branch at small phase angles, a counterintuitive dip in polarized light that tells of complex grain surfaces and sizes, and its depth and width whisper differences in texture that no camera can see. He lets that small specialized fact rest without insistence. Filters and slits translate glow into chemistry. Diatomic carbon contributes green light in swan bands. Cyanogen and H radicals add their pale signatures. Oxygen atoms born from water's dissociation scatter forbidden, red and green lines that are anything but forbidden in the sky. A sodium tail may appear as a ghost, narrow, delicate, and aligned with sunlight like a wire drawn from the nucleus, though in many comets it is too faint for casual notice. Spectra built night after night turn into production rates for parent molecules and lifetimes for daughters. The cadence is slow, the plot points climb and settle. AFAR. A dusty proxy with a name as soft as it is technical gathers the coma's brightness into a single value that hardly feels like the living, breathing thing it represents, and yet it carries enough constancy to compare night's telescopes and distances without forgetting what was done to the data. Only took a symbol and a small Greek letter to hold an atmosphere millions of kilometres wide, he thinks, and it mostly works. Only needs a few lines in a spectrum to recover a family of molecules older than our oceans. Only requires the sun to shine a little harder for a stone to grow a sky. The nucleus remains veiled, a compact object of ancient dark with an albedo so low it drinks most of the light that finds it warmer than the space around it, but colder than anyone's to human language. Its shape is inferred by motion more than by sight, and the rotation state is a puzzle set by timing in the jets. If a fan brightens and dims in a rhythm, if the vector of non-gravitational acceleration turns as days pass, then a spin axis is hiding there waiting to be coaxed into numbers. But the mystery is durable. Jet sources may migrate as layers peel. Outgassing can torque the body and drift the period by seconds. Thermal skin depth. How far a day's warmth penetrates depends on porosity that instruments cannot touch. A small world breathes through pores and cracks. The breath changes the world, the change moves the breath. The feedback is real and quiet and difficult to isolate. He allows the unsolved to remain unsolved without apology. Around the nucleus, the coma organizes itself into regimes. Close-in gas-and grains share a crowded microgravity colliding, fracturing, sintering in slow motion that still outruns any human glance. Beyond a few tens of nucleus radii, the flow becomes freer and collisions fall away. Farther still, solar photons rule the smallest grains, pushing them outward into arcs that widen and thin, while the largest clasts follow nearly inertial paths, their arcs barely different from that of the nucleus. Syndyne's curves of constant beta sketch families of particle sizes. Synchrone's curves of constant release time sketch the memoir of when the surface spoke. These are plotting tools, old and reliable, that turn a pale fan into a memory one can diagram. He does not draw them here, but he carries their logic like a map folded in a quiet pocket. Temperature sits at the centre of every turn in this section. Not an imagined heat, but a calculated balance where absorbed sunlight thermal emission, sublimation cooling and re-radiation settle to a value that creeps through the diurnal cycle. Morning on the nucleus is a concept more than a place. As rotation brings a rough plane into sunlight, frost warms and thins. Pockets release their first molecules and shadows shorten into nothing before growing long again. In that cycle, different volatiles speak in different registers. Carbon monoxide breathes in the cold. Carbon dioxide adds its note in the middle. Water waits for closer sun. Stratigraphy matters. If water-rich layers lie beneath, if a crust of sintered dust caps them, then the pressure rises locally until cracks admit the flow and the resulting jets trace those cracks into space. Refractory grains, irregular and pitted, take the ride, then drift and scatter light with all the strange angles only irregular things can show. The coma's colour is often a pale red in broadband because dust grains list toward larger sizes and carry organics that tint. Its spectrum is a choir of thin lines on a thick continuum, both quiet and instructive. There is nothing here that requires myth. Gas, dust, sunlight, and gravity are sufficient material for a sky that travels with the stone. He adds 3 dry observations as if placing small markers on a map. They call it brightening, yet the nucleus grows no larger. Only its borrowed atmosphere does. They call it shedding mass, yet most of what is lost is measured in kilograms per second across an area the size of a city, a rate that is both prodigious and negligible depending on the loneliness of your units. They call it volatile, yet the underlying rock and ice matrix holds together across heat and cold that would shatter human structures, a sobriety written in thermal inertia rather than in will. The heliosphere streams past and through. Solar wind protons meet a growing cloud of neutral water and pick up electrons, becoming fast neutrals that leave imprints on spectra and minor disturbances in the plasma around the comet. A bow-like feature, too grand a word for something so faint, shapes upstream. An ion tail aligns with magnetic field lines that the solar wind carries outward from the sun. The dust tail, heavier and slower, holds to a different script and lags away like smoke that never truly mixes with the air around it. Together they sketch a double geometry that has fooled many first glances and educated many second ones. In long exposures the dust is a soft fan. In narrowband frames the ions are a taut ribbon. The same source, 2 different conversations with sunlight and fields. Observers lean on repetition. Night after night they measure the apparent magnitude in matched apertures, correct for distance to the sun and earth, subtract a steady sky, and note the way brightness tracks heliocentric distance with an exponent that rarely stays the same eastbound and outbound. Surfaces change, vents fatigue, layers peel, or simply viewing geometry complicates a tidy law. The curve on the light plot becomes another kind of orbit, one through parameter space rather than through the inner system, and it loops differently on approach and retreat. He lets the analogy go no further. The coma does not argue, it displays. Closer to Mars's path, where warmth is firm and reliable, the green of diatomic carbon may pool in small telescopes as a mute halo. while larger instruments pick out the faint red forbidden oxygen line that comes not from oxygen stored alone, but from water molecules split by sunlight into fragments that carry no memory of their origin, except their numbers. Isotopes hide in line positions and shapes. Ratios of carbon and nitrogen ask for longer exposures yet. The match to solar system comets becomes a quiet question, with a quiet initial answer, similar in many ways, different in a few, familiar enough to fold into models without inventing new chemistry. If carbon monoxide is relatively strong, if dust to gas ratios shift with distance in a way that suggests deep persistent pores, then the traveller's birth disk may have been cold and populous in volatile ices, or its residence within that disk may have been far from its star before the ejection. That inference is soft, consistent with data, and yet not demanded by it. He says it once and leaves it there. He lets the section settle where physics becomes almost imperceptible choreography. The nucleus rotates, the sub-solar point crawls, pores, exhale grains, lift and separate. Radiation sorts, plasma aligns, and a sky that did not exist the 1 season ago now extends thousands of kilometers across, then millions. A moving atmosphere so tenuous that a human could walk through it and not feel it, so abundant that it fills a telescope's field. The fact remains tight, and unadorned sunlight warms ice. Ice becomes gas, gas carries dust, dust scatters light. The mystery remains patient and respectful. Where exactly the vents open, how the rotation wanders under seasonal talks, whether the crust thickens or thins as days pass. The ironies sit where he placed them, small stones along a path hardly anyone needs to walk twice. The coma continues to breathe. Mars orbits on indifferent. The traveller moves inward, not hurrying already, tracing the gentle beginning of a departure written inside its approach. He lets light do the talking because light remembers where it has been. Instruments divide the coma's glow into bands and lines, thin features laid across a broad continuum, and each feature is a thread that leads backward to a molecule, a fragment, a grain. The fact at the centre of this section is steady, and sufficient fluorescence under sunlight drives cometary emission molecules, and radicals absorb photons and re-emit it at specific wavelengths, so spectra become inventories. In the blue, a near-ultraviolet cyanogen's bandhead rises like a pale cliff. Diatomic carbon lays down the swan bands, a faint green gramma that photographers sometimes mistake for the colour of the nucleus. Amid those structures, the ciliary band appears and vanishes, with distance as if breathing. Farther out in red oxygen, forbidden lines at 6,300 and 5,577 angstroms, whisper of water's dissociation, the parent is shy, the daughters speak. Near 308 nanometers, the OH band announces what cannot be seen directly. H2O broken by the sunlight into fragments that betray their origin the way weather betrays topography. In the infrared, row vibrational lines pull carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide into view. In the thermal continuum, warm dust re-radiates sunlight. It cannot keep spilling, a smooth hill of heat that shifts with distance like a tide. Nothing here requires imagination. It requires time, a slit aligned across a blur, and calibrations that keep the sky honest. He lingers on a lesser-known detail, a quiet piece of bookkeeping called the G factor. Each molecule's fluorescence efficiency depends on the solar spectrum and on the Doppler shift of the comet as it moves. A small change in speed slides a band into or out of resonance, nudging its brightness. Analysts update G-factors with heliocentric velocity so that line intensities become production rates rather than mood swings. The correction is not dramatic. It is a modest humility that turns colour into counting. With counting, textures appear. Carbon monoxide may be strong at large distance, then hold or fall. Carbon dioxide may build as sunlight firms. Water waits for a closer sun and then leads. Ratios between them sketch temperatures of formation and residence not as absolutes, but as ranges consistent with disks where frost lines migrate and collisional histories blur the simple picture. Dust blended into that chemistry tells its own slower story. Broadband colours redden the coma because grains are irregular, organics are present, and the scattering slope prefers long wavelengths. Thermal emission around 10 micrometers can carry a broken plateau, hinting at silicate grains olivine and pyroxene, whose crystalline fractions speak of processing in a young star's warm inner regions and transport outward through a disk that was more conveyor than moat. He leaves that inference soft on purpose because comets carry both crystalline and amorphous silicates, and the recipe varies from body to body. The dust phase function, how brightness depends on the angle of light and sight, becomes a quiet geometry lesson. Forward, scattering lifts brightness when the comet stands almost between sun and observer. Backscattering adds little. Polarization dips into a negative branch at small phase angles that only irregular rough grains can explain. Those are lines on plots, not colours to the eye, and yet they carry texture, porosity and coherence between them, like a fingerprint pressed on glass. They call it a green comet, he notes dryly, though the nucleus remains blacker than fresh asphalt, and the green is only the glow of C2 in an atmosphere too thin to feel. They call the dust dirty, though the dirt is older than Earth's crust and includes silicates annealed and transported before the solar system settled. They call the spectrum simple, though the calibration arcs through lamp lines, solar analog stars, instrument response and sky subtraction before a single number means what it says. He lets the coma's chemistry keep speaking. Nitrogen sits inside CN and NH. Sulfur traces appear in CS and other faint bands that require long patient integration. Sodium may draw a thin solar-aligned tail that looks like a hair suddenly made of metal and light. In the ion realm, CO+ and N2+ sometimes thread the spectrum with narrow electric lines, field-following signatures that confirm a magnetized wind is touching the traveller. Each detection folds into a Hazer-style model, or its more careful descendants, separating parent lifetimes from daughter lifetimes, assigning scale lengths that stretch with heliocentric distance, and allowing observers to translate brightness into molecules per second through a column of space that rotates with the night. It is a discipline of turning light back into matter without touching the matter. The mystery that remains is quiet and useful. Abundance ratios are context without coordinates. From carbon monoxide to water, from dust to gas to crystalline silicate fractions, the numbers point toward cold formation and a life spent beyond a frost line, but they do not name a star, a disk radius or a path. DH ratios in water, if measured at all, can differ among comets by factors that confound a single nursery. Nitrogen's isotopes drift in ways that argue for multiple reservoirs. Organics present both simplicity and complexity, simple chains and ringed compounds without resolving the mix of interstellar inheritance and disk processing. The comet answers questions by narrowing them. It leaves place and time to models and humility. Mid-infrared imaging warms the dust enough to sketch the nucleus by absence. The unresolved core, a steep bright point wrapped in coma, pulls the surface brightness door's profile upward at small radii. Subtracting a point spread function yields a residual that refuses to show shape. Shape reveals itself instead through the timescale of jet repeats and through lifetimes of fragments that drift down the tail like faint commas pulling their punctuation across space as if marking clauses in a sentence that never ends. He allows a gentle analogy because it carries no weight. The spectrum is a ledger kept in light, each line a careful entry, each continuum a margin note about warmth and grain size. The heliosphere writes in this ledger as well. Charge exchange between solar wind protons and neutral water produces fast hydrogen that paints ultraviolet light. The ion tail aligns with the interplanetary magnetic field like a windsock you can only see by counting photons. Bow-like structures and mass loading soften the flow, changing the field, and sometimes when a coronal mass ejection passes the ion tail kinks and disconnects a visible wall set that leaves dust undisturbed. One body, two conversations, ions speak to fields. Dust speaks to light and momentum. The three ironies he places now are small and patient. Only took a handful of photons per square centimetre per second to read the inventory of a world that has travelled for millions of years. Only required subtraction of the sky to see the sky that travels with the comet. Only needed a slit a millimetre wide to measure an atmosphere millions of kilometres across. In the near-nucleus region, temperatures are neither fierce nor frozen. They are precise balances. Absorbed sunlight equals thermal radiation, plus the latent heat carried away by sublimation. The surplus warms subsurface pores by millimetres per diurnal cycle. If the upper layer sinters and compacts, permeability falls, pressure rises, vents migrate. If the crust cracks, flows reorganize. The coma's chemistry therefore changes not only with distance from the sun, but with the comet's own evolving surface. That evolution is not arc plot or lesson. It is an accumulation of tiny material decisions made by pores and grains. He names the accepted process once more and lets it anchor the scene. Water photo-dissociates to OH and then to O and H. Those daughters emit at known wavelengths with lifetimes that set the scales of the coma. Consequently, OH is our stand-in for water, and OI is our stand-in for OH. With that chain and with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide lines in the infrared, observers build a daily ledger of the comet's breathing. They compare inbound against outbound, and find hysteresis born of seasons and geometry. Morning and evening on a rotating tumbling shape do not match, and so neither do the plots. Dust adds an aftertaste to the light. Grains twist polarization vectors into patterns that map jets. Their size distributions tilt toward a power law whose slope changes with time. Their mineralogy couples the present coma to ancient furnaces and radial mixing in a disk that once moved heat and matter like a slow storm. Some nights the 10-micron silicate emission looks strong, some nights it is a shoulder rather than a peak. Telescopes differ, reduction choices differ, the comet itself alters its face. The lesson is not indecision but texture. He preserves uncertainty as part of the portrait. The working picture remains spare and sufficient. An interstellar visitor, now clearly cometary in behaviour, exhales water, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Its dust carries silicates and organics. Its lines fluoresce under the sun. Its ions align with the magnetic field the comet did not bring. Ratios among species and the shapes of bands suggest a birthplace beyond a frost line and a life of cold storage with some materials heated and crystallized before being moved outward by a young star's restless disk. None of this names the nursery or the epoch. All of it says that planet formation is a scattering machine as well as an accretion engine, that disks do not keep everything they make, and that the galaxy is seeded with fragments that carry local histories across interstellar distances without losing their quiet. He leaves the section where the ledger closes for the night. The spectrograph's shutter slides, the detector cools, standard stars set the scale back to common daylight. In the morning, numbers will become rates and rates will become sentences folded into a log. For now, the comet keeps its breath without a witness. The spectrum persists as potential in every photon that will leave the coma today and every day until sunlight fades. The mystery remains deliberate and small, which star, which disk, radius, which scattering, that set the traveller free. The ironies remain in place like grains that have fallen out of gas and will never be recaptured. The light, having spoken, returns to silence. He turns the scale outward until time becomes texture, because the traveller's substance predates anything Earth has that can be called weather. The accepted fact sits quietly near the beginning and does not need to be raised above a whisper. Interstellar comets are assembled from primordial solids that condense in other young planetary systems, material that is at least as old as the solar system, and may carry structures and isotopic signatures formed before Earth hold stable oceans. Dust and ice that predate our seas now drift through our light, a calm exchange with no handover. The way-in is mathematical and unhurried. Speeds measured far from the sun when reduced to the frame that follows the galaxy's average local motion place the traveller within the slow hum of neighbourhood stars, not as an outlier, but as a participant in the background tide. Its path is a sentence continued from elsewhere rather than a shout arriving from far away. That moderation fits a history not of catastrophe but of patience. In a nursery disk around some other star grains of silicate and carbon of ice, and simple organics settle toward a mid-plane, collide, stick, roll and grow. Pebbles learn the drag of gas and drift inward until pressure bumps or vortices lend them a place to gather. Far from the star beyond a frost line that migrates as the young sun brightens and dims water, and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide take solid form and wrap mineral kernels in shells of ice. Nothing dramatic occurs in any single hour. The hour accumulates into 1,000,000, then more, and bodies the size of hills wake into existence and forget that they were powder. Giant planets assembling nearby stir the disk with gravity so gentle and so relentless that a fraction of small bodies take the one-way path outward, a small positive in energy that erases any future of return. One of those bodies is this one. Ejection is not a throw, but a tide. It does not feel like a decision. The ejected small world enters a darkness that is not empty. For long intervals it crosses the dilute gas of the interstellar medium a few atoms per cubic centimetre, too little to bend its path or warm its face, and yet enough over long runs of time to abrade fragile surfaces, molecule by a molecule. Galactic cosmic rays strike and pass, carrying energies that lay tracks of broken bonds in the outermost layers of the ice. Radiolysis turned clean lattices into more complex chemistry, roughing a pristine surface into something brown with organics that form in place without heat, a crust the thickness of a thought renewed and altered so slowly that change is indistinguishable from rest. This is a lesser-known detail that belongs here over long timescales, irradiation in deep. Cold can create refractory organic residues, tholins, in the broad laboratory sense that darken and redden the upper skin-raising albedo only by its refusal to reflect and adding to the coma later when sunlight reanimates what the dark has stored. The traveller crosses spiral structure without noticing. There is no frontier at the arm's edge, only an increase in star density and in light that deepens the sky rather than brightening the road. The sun, for its part, drifts around the galaxy as a quiet companion to this long passage, so that the meeting that now occurs is a matter of two motions that happen to cross, not a chase finally resolved. He keeps the scale large and the verb small. A molecular cloud might have been a region the traveller once crossed, a puffy cold where density rises by orders of magnitude, where dust grows frost and gas condenses into thickened coats. But even there, the time between collisions is a season by comet standards. Even there, the surface accumulates rather than erodes, gentle layers added without pressure. If close to a star now and then, the body would have warmed and exhaled and whitened its trail in sunlight other than ours. If never near it, would have slept the whole way, changing anyway, because cold and radiation are also change. Isotopes hold the memory that shape conceals. Deuterium in water. If it could be measured in this traveller would likely mark a ratio that helps place the temperatures at which the ice condensed. Carbon and nitrogen in the gases that soon fill the coma speak in accented lines that catalogue choices made by a disk that is not ours. Crystalline silicates, if present in the dust's thermal glow, tell of heating in inner regions and transport outward before ejection. Amorphous grains tell of assembly in shadows where stars are inference rather than presence. Nothing here points to a name or a date. Everything points to a range, to a practice, to a pattern. He lets the mystery remain properly sized. The star of origin is unknown, and may remain unknown, because backwards integrations of a hyperbola dissolve into noise once you leave the solar system's gravity and enter the galaxies where small uncertainties amplify across millions of years, and a field of moving suns refuses to sit still for a reconstruction. The night toward which the comet will go, after it leaves the sun, holds no signpost labelled home. It will be a different night than the one from which it came. That is enough. He notices ironies that do not require a smile. Only took a little excess speed above escape to turn a citizen of one system into a citizen of none. Only carried a rind a few molecules thick to speak for a chemical history that spans the time between star births. Only needed the faintest density of interstellar gas to sand a surface into something that later glows in telescopes as if it were made to be seen. The galaxy provides rooms the size of tens of parsecs where nothing happens quickly, and everything changes anyway. In those rooms, supernova remnants expand without touching. Ultraviolet light from hot stars cleans dust from the centres of cavities and leaves the edges rich. Magnetic fields thread through like wires in slow motion. The traveller passes through with hardly a deflection mass, unchanged, internal temperature regulated by emptiness. If it rotates, the spin remains near what the ejection gave it, modified over eras by impacts too small to notice individually and by surface torques too weak to mention, without the patience of eons. Its interior stays colder than any laboratory vacuum chamber, warmer than the cosmic microwave background by the continuity of its own radiative balance, insulating itself with porosity, the way snow insulates a field by making air part of its body. The idea that such a fragment should arrive now is not a specialness but a sampling truth. Surveys improve, fields widen, exposures multiply, and what was once invisible becomes a matter of data cadence rather than of fate. The path this traveller takes through the inner heliosphere is rare in human lifetimes and common in galactic lifetimes. In that contrast, he finds a quiet measure of scale. He allows a gentle analogy because it does not instruct, it simply clarifies. The interstellar object is a time capsule, not because someone sealed it and sent it, but because low temperature and low pressure act as an archive slowing reactions until a chemistry inherits not a moment but a span. The capsule opens whenever sunlight arrives. Anywhere at any star it closes again, wherever darkness returns. Our sun now plays the archivist. Later another may. The accepted processes stay unadorned grains. Condensed pebbles stick. Planetesimals form giant planets scatter. Small bodies escape and the galaxy collects what falls out of its own making. The present encounter is a reading, not a change in the text. He returns to the object itself because the narrative is not about the galaxy in general, but about this small stone. Its outer few centimetres may be altered by irradiation. Beneath ice remains that has not seen sunlight since it first condensed. Pores link shards into a framework that supports a vacuum so perfect it becomes a property rather than a condition. Organics are not seasoning, they are a component polymers and chains that reduce albedo and increase warmth in the sawless way that still matters at tens of Kelvin. If brittle layers cap more volatile rich strata, the first perihelion the object experiences around our sun, will lift lids that have been fixed for an age. Later perihelia, if they were to occur, would show a changed face. But this traveller has only one pass. It is a fragile one-time river of gas and dust written across a sky that does not keep anything. 3 more observations sit like pins in a map. They call it ancient because the chemistry tells of cold, but the coma it grows is newborn every hour. They call it pristine, yet cosmic rays and micrometeoroids have been editing its surface since before the solar system formed. They call it a messenger, though it carries no message, only a record that readers must assemble without knowing where to shelve it. He lets the section slow until the scale feels natural again. The object approaches perihelion with the calm of a stone being warmed. Its material is older than our seas, older than any river valley, older than the first clouds that moved across an earth that had crust enough to bear them. It is not a relic, it is a process that continues, and the process is the galaxy making and unmaking edges, pulling some pieces inward to fuel new stars and pushing some outward to wander. In the quiet middle of that, a small body arrives at our sun, releases the thin weather it has prepared in darkness and moves on. The oceans that cover Earth now are a recent practice compared to this. The continents are still newer rearrangement. The life that names and measures this visitor a modern note in a long chord that began before names. He keeps the timescales nested and leaves them undisturbed. The fact stands where it began, material assembled beyond our sun, now enters our light. The lesser-known detail rests beside it, radiation in deep cold rites, organics into the outer skin. The mystery remains where it belongs. The nursery, the star, the exact path, outward, unresolved, unneeded. For the night's purpose. The traveller keeps to its schedule, which is not a schedule at all, only a continuation. The galaxy turns under it like a slow wheel. The heliosphere meets it like breath meeting winter air. The ocean-bearing planet watches from one lane inward and records what it can before darkness resumes its work. He returns to the workshop where such travellers are made a flat, faint disk of gas and dust around a young star because origins explain gently and enough. The accepted fact carries the seen protoplanetary disks condense from collapsing molecular clouds, and within those disks solids grow from micron grains to planetesimals and planets, while gravitational encounters with forming giants can eject small bodies into interstellar space. The picture has no need for spectacle. A cloud core falls inward. Conservation of angular momentum spreads material into a rotating sheet. The star accretes at the centre, and the disk warms from both viscous dissipation and starlight. Temperatures fall with distance and height. Somewhere a frost line migrates as the star brightens and the accretion rate declines. Inside water exists as vapour and coats grains only in passing. Outside water is ice and makes grains sticky in a way that rock alone cannot manage. Grains collide, stick roll, and compact turbulence stirs them. Gas drags them. Some grow to millimetres, then centimetres, then decimeters, and then feel the headwind of sub-Keprian gas and drift inward like slow rain toward heat. In that rain, the disk organises itself. Pressure bumps arise at snow lines, at dead zone boundaries where ionisation falls and turbulence quiets at edges of young planets' gaps. Those bumps reverse the usual gas headwind and collect pebbles into long-lived shelves where growth outruns loss. He places a lesser-known detail carefully on that shelf. When the local solids-to-gas ratio exceeds a few percent the streaming instability couples pebbles to gas and concentrates them into dense filaments that collapse under self-gravity into 100-kilometre-class planetesimals on timescales far shorter than sticking alone would allow. It is an instability with a calm name and a decisive effect. Bodies large enough to feel their own gravity gather from the fog. Some remain rubble, piles some sinter and weld. Some become cores for planets if they find enough pebbles to feed on. Pebble accretion is efficient where relative speeds are low, and hill spheres are forgiving. A core a few times Earth's mass can accrete gas before the disk disperses, as long as the clock has not run down. Where it does run down, super-Earths and Neptunes remain. Where it does not, giants inflate and take stations that rechart the disk. The traveller's birth neighbourhood is likely beyond a moving frost line, where water and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide stay solid and add their stickiness to mineral frameworks. There planetesimals inherit layered chemistries, silicates at the heart, ices around them, organics everywhere. Dust has seen both starlight and deep cold. As young giants assemble inward or outward of that zone, resonances sweep the disk like soft rakes migrating with the planets as gas torques exchange angular momentum between orbits and pressure gradients. Some small bodies are shepherded into belts, some are scattered inward and ground down, some are tossed outward onto loosely bound arcs that will either settle into distant clouds or with a little extra energy pass beyond the star forever. Ejection is not a flourish. It is a small surplus in a ledger of encounters, a single strong scattering with a giant or a sum of smaller ones, or a resonance that sends perihelion inward from meeting with a massive planet that turns angle into speed. The sign of the energy change decides the future. A positive excess, even a modest one, writes interstellar into the object's long script. He keeps the verbs patient. A star's ultraviolet light shapes the disk's skin. X-rays and cosmic rays set the ionization that determines where magneto-rotational turbulence lives and where it sleeps. Photoevaporative winds peel the disk from its edges, and from a hot inner cavity once viscous heating falls. As the gas thins, aerodynamic drag weakens, pebble accretion slows, and the window for giant planet growth closes almost without announcement. What remains are planets on imperfectly spaced tracks and populations of small bodies that carry the history of where and when they formed. The disk disperses in a few million years, the architecture persists for billions. He lets a gentle analogy sit without weight. The disk is an orchestra that plays only once. The score is thermodynamics and gravity. The recording is a set of orbits. Against that recording, the traveller's a quiet outtake. 3 dry observations belong here aligned, like markers in a field. They call it ejected as if it were thrown in anger, yet the arithmetic is unromantic angular momentum, exchanged total energy, signed the surplus above escape summed over encounters that no one watched. They call it an interstellar comet as if that were a category apart, yet disks make legions of small icy worlds and giants scatter many. Rarity belongs to discovery, not to production. They call the nursery distant, yet the chemistry it leaves and the comet's ice speaks in the same elements and minerals that fill our own shelves. Distance here is a difference in proportion, not in alphabet. In the calm of models he leaves a mystery intact and visible. The exact sequence of events, how many giants, where they formed, how far they migrated, which resonance doled the last increment of energy, remains unknowable for this one body, because the integrals that would carry the orbit backward dissolve into chaos as soon as the galaxy enters the calculation, and because the nursery's planets have moved on in ways no light from the coma can name. The puzzle is not an absence, it is a boundary that keeps its inference honest. Within the boundary there is texture. Snowlines mark transitions not just in phase, but in sticking properties and opacities, so the migration of those lines changes where and how solids grow. Carbon monoxide snowline lies far out and blurs into the disk's slow cold, while water's snowline sweeps inward with time and alters the recipe for planets that form in its wake. Mid-plane temperatures set which ices condense. Vertical mixing dredges processed grains downward and lifts fresh frost upward. Radial drift makes inward zones briefly rich in material that originally formed far away. Transport is not a flaw, it is how disks mix their ingredients. In such a setting, the traveller's layered inventory makes sense, without specifying longitude or star. Crystalline silicates could have been baked near the star and carried outward by winds or turbulence before finding a home in a far cold clump. Amorphous silicates could have condensed in shadow and stayed as they were. Organics could have formed both in the parent cloud and in the disk itself under ultraviolet light and cosmic rays. The nucleus's darkness is an outcome of that chemistry and of time, not a statement of intent. A young giant's migration completes the script. Type 2 migration governed by talks between planet and gas reshapes resonances. In some systems, giants move inward to hot stations before the gas leaves. In others, they remain at several astronomical units. In still others, they move outward if disk conditions permit. Wherever they settle, the gravitational reach of a few Jupiter-mass body over tens of millions of years is patient enough to lift many small worlds into loss. Some scatter onto distant, loosely bound orbits. Some contribute to an Oort-like cloud. Some clear the threshold where the star's pull never again demands accounting. The traveller crosses that threshold, likely cold, likely small, likely unremarkable in the tally its system kept at the time. He steps back from particulars and allows the slow mechanics to be the narrative. The disk thins, the gas goes, collision rates fall, belts and clouds remain. The star ages, quieting its high-energy outbursts. Any remaining migration is now gravitational among planets rather than hydrodynamic with gas. The scattered population keeps being sculpted by secular resonances and weak encounters for eons, a faint sifting that changes orbits without altering counts. Against that long grey work, interstellar loss continues at a slow rate that, multiplied by the number of systems and the length of galactic time, makes the space between stars gently populous in small cold things. The traveller is one of them. A lesser-known note rests at the disk's edge. Photoevaporative clearing can open a pressure maximum that traps pebbles and planetesimals just outside the gap, briefly boosting growth there and altering the later scattering statistics, a local change that might matter for how many bodies are placed on escape paths. He names it and leaves it because it is a refinement, not a requirement. The section keeps its tone even as it closes around the idea that suffices disks make solids, planets form, giants perturb, some small bodies go. The chemistry the traveller carries is a notebook of temperatures and transport, not a passport. Its orbit through our light is a crossing, not a visit. Its ejection was an arithmetic step, not an event with sound. He allows 3 scales to sit together without competition. On human scales, the comet is brief and almost missed. On planetary system scales, it is a byproduct of formation. On galactic scales, it is a normal constituent released into a medium that forgets origins and remembers only motions. The sun meeting it now adds warmth and a page to our ledger, but not a line to its biography. The nursery remains unnamed and unneeded for the physics to stand. The accepted fact anchors where it began. A distant disk assembled the body and a giant's gravity set it free. The lesser-known detail keeps a quiet place. The streaming instability's threshold turns dust into rock quickly enough to populate a disk with ejectables. The mystery holds its line. The system's architecture and timing are beyond recovery. The ironies remain like small cairns along a plane thrown by arithmetic, rare to us and common to the galaxy, far in origin and familiar in matter. He lets the workshop dim as the gas fades, leaving orbits and cold things. The traveller exits the only home it ever had by a step so small no one there noticed, and ages afterward, it drifts through our light, with the same indifference, carrying a record that is complete enough to teach, and incomplete enough to keep the night quiet. He follows the traveller outward in thought away from the sun and back into the long corridors where time turns from duration into background. Between stars motion is steady and unperformed. The accepted fact at the heart of this section is small and sufficient. An unbound body leaving the solar system will coast through the galaxy on a nearly straight path in the local frame, perturbed only gently by the smooth tide of galactic gravity and the rare distant tugs of passing stars. Nothing in that sentence asks for a spectacle. The galaxy's disk holds the shallows of matter, stars' gas dust arranged in a thin sheet with a soft bulge at the centre. Within it, orbits look circular when described coarsely, and like slow rosettes when described with care. A small body's course is an inertial line written inside that larger rotation barely bent by fields it shares with everything else. The sun itself loops the centre in a broad lane, and nods above and below the midplane on a timescale that concerns only geological patience. The traveller is not bound to that nod, yet it rides through the same neighbourhoods because the neighbourhoods are broad. The interstellar medium is present, but it is not a wind in any human sense. A few atoms per cubic centimetre in typical warm phases, fewer in hot bubbles carved by old supernova, more in cold clouds that sleep between new star births. Most of space is a mild vacuum that cannot push a stone, only greet it. Drag is a word that does not belong here. Collisions happen, but they are better counted by their absence. Dust grains and things strike at high speed and leave microscopic pits that do not reach the nucleus core. Cosmic rays pluck bonds in surface molecules and leave chemistry older and browner. Ultraviolet light lifts electrons from grains and lets charges balance and rebalance without ever changing the path. This is the lesser-known detail he allows to rest without decoration over long, cold ages. Irradiation in interstellar space slowly builds refractory organic skins. Laboratory tholins in the broad sense microns to millimeters thick, darkening the uppermost layer and lowering albedo. Beneath that skin, ice remains what it was when assembled, because the diffusion lengths and reaction rates at tens of Kelvin are almost stillness. The traveller's loneliness is not an emotion. It is a result of mean-free paths so large that a single body can cross parsecs without meeting anything large enough to matter. Yet the galaxy speaks softly through tides. The smooth gravitational field of disk and halo stretches orbits into curves that are not exactly straight. Vertical force toward the plane calls objects back when they stray. Differential rotation turns straight lines into tiny epicycles in diagrams that only astronomers draw. These do not add up to a shepherd, they add up to a grammar. When stars pass rarely close, usually far, they impart impulses that alter speed and direction by small amounts, more often a correction than a rewrite. The possibility of a close encounter exists, but its probability is so thin that it belongs to statistics rather than to narrative. He leaves the numbers unwritten and lets the quality stand course unchanged in essence, tinctured in detail by fields and neighbours. The mystery holds a seat near the window and does not try to move which star cast the last significant tug before the traveller crossed our heliosphere. Which association or arm segment supplied the nursery? Backward integration dissolves into uncertainty as soon as the solar system's pull gives way to the galaxies. The map of past positions spreads like ink in water, because every small error grows over millions of years, and because other stars are not stayed for our reconstruction. The traveller carries no beacon with a date, no isotope clock that singles out an address rather than a temperature. The best we make are ranges, not coordinates. He sets 3 dry observations along the path where they can be seen and then forgotten. They call it interstellar space as if it were empty, yet the traveller moves through a medium that lights ionizes charges and edits with patience. They call the path straight, yet the galaxy's tide writes a slow bow into every line and no one walking could notice. They call the stone unchanged, yet its outermost molecules have been rewritten by time until the word unchanged only fits the interior. The story of the long drift is slow work. Charging equilibria establish on the surface when ultraviolet light and plasma meet dark grains. Electrons depart in sunlight, return in shadow, and the potential floats at a quiet compromise set by fields and fluxes. Sputtering by energetic ions removes atoms here and there, but so rarely that a century's worth of loss is a figure better compared to nothing than to erosion. Micrometeoroid strikes happen in bursts, more common in dusty filaments, almost absent in cavities. They leave glassy traces that do not signify to the orbit. Radiation builds defects in ices, dangling bonds that later recombine when warmed near a star, releasing small molecules that look like volatiles made on the spot and were in part rehearsed in the dark. None of this has urgency. The traveller precesses through neighbourhoods that have names in star catalogues and no names in human memory, interarm regions where the sky is thin and blue-white stars are fewer, arm segments where H2 regions glow at the edges of clouds and dust slices light into soft lanes. The difference to a small body is one of flux, not of fate. In clouds, if crossed, frost thickens. In cavities like our local bubble, if crossed, the plasma thins and heat jumps in temperature while falling in density. The heliosphere itself, which the traveller once entered and will now leave, breathes with the sun's cycle. Its boundary shifts outward and inward with wind pressure that varies through years and centuries. But all such motions are a narrow weather compared to the traveller's long climate of almost nothing. The line it follows is a compromise between initial ejection and all subsequent whispers. He allows a gentle analogy that neither instructs nor misleads the course, is like a pencil line drawn on a slowly turning drum, straight at the tip, curved on the cylinder, preserved in essence as the drum rolls on. He returns to the nucleus because the interior remembers better than the path. Porosity keeps heat out and stress low. The lack of tidal shaking in interstellar space leaves fractures where they are. The spin keeps what a distant encounter gave it unless outgassing near stars alters it. If the period wanders now, it will be because sunlight near perihelion has torqued jets into a slight bias. In deep night, Yorp-like torques are absent because they require sunlight. Out here only impulses can change spin, and there are none to count. The surface is likely stratified, irradiated crust pockets of more volatile ices, below mineral grains everywhere, voids linking it all. The thirst of vacuum is absolute but has nothing to drink. He lets the section's accepted fact rest again in a different phrasing. The galaxy provides a tidal field and a statistical reign of distant encounters. For a small unbound object, those are perturbations, not governors. When it crosses a star's wind again, somewhere and some era from now, the same heliophysical grammar will unfold a coma, a tail, a photometric rise, a spectrum that arranges lines into ratios, then departure. The traveller repeats the lesson wherever sunlight finds it. If it never passes near a star again, the skin will thicken its organics by the width of a thought. The interior will remain as it has been. He pauses at the scale where spiral arms themselves are not pillars, but density waves that move through the disk, gathering star formation near their crests and leaving decaying clusters in their wakes. The traveller treats those waves as scenery. The arm is not a wall. It is a region where stars are newer and dust is thicker. The odds of a meaningful encounter rise there and remain small. He notes a quiet lesser detail nested here. The local standard of rest, the notional average motion of stars near the sun, is a frame in which many interstellar objects' velocities look modest, and the traveller's speed with respect to that frame likely sits nearer calm than chase. This is one reason its path through our system has felt precise rather than violent. Calmer entry yields geometry that instruments can love. He does not name the numbers. He lets calm stand in for them. The ironies keep their order as he draws the corridor onward. Only took a fraction of a meter per second added in the right place long ago to decide millions of years of freedom. Only requires the thinnest gas to change colours we later call composition. Only needs the slowest gravities to tie every free line into a curve someone could discover if they had patience and a diagram that forgives scale. The remainder of the section returns to the feeling of the drift without losing its plain science. The galaxy's mid-plane lies as a dim stripe in the traveller's sky, thicker there with stars thinner farther up. Globular clusters hang like distant unmoving bees. The bulge is a pale swelling no small body can aim for or away from. In that composition, one more piece of dust the size of a mountain passes unnoticed, and yet its passages near stars are the only times it is seen. Visibility is not a property but a circumstance. The sun supplied circumstance this once. The next may be some other star with a survey of its own, with detectors named in a language not yet invented. With a calendar that writes years we would not recognize. The nucleus will be the same nucleus under a few layers of change. The coma will be the same physics ledgers kept in light inventories made of fluorescence and scattering. The line it follows between those meetings is the same line the section began with, almost straight, almost alone, almost unchanged. He lets the passage return to quiet. The accepted fact has been placed. The lesser surface chemistry has been named, the mystery of origin keeps its shape. The three dry observations sit where they belong like small cairns on a plain that does not need marking. The traveller moves unhurried through a medium that rarely touches and always surrounds, through a gravity that commands softly and without edges, through neighbourhoods whose differences are gradients rather than gates. It is not on a mission, it is not returning. It simply persists, and in persisting it offers a line for us to measure and a calm for us to borrow. He stands with the boundary because boundaries teach by contrast. Far from the planets where the sun's breath thins into a long exhale, the traveller meets the heliosphere, a vast bubble blown by the solar wind into the local interstellar medium. And the accepted fact settles without ceremony, where a neutral icy coma meets a magnetized plasma mass. Loading slows the wind field lines drape, and an ion tail forms aligned with the interplanetary magnetic field. The grammar changes at first contact. Neutral molecules streaming from the nucleus are photonized by sunlight or struck by hot electrons. The newborn ions, suddenly aware of fields they did not feel a moment before, are picked up by the solar wind and spiral with the adding inertia that forces the wind to trade speed for charge. The field carried outward by the wind like threads in flowing cloth bends around the obstacle of the expanding atmosphere, and a long narrow ion tail extends anti-sunward as if drawn with a fine wire. Nothing explodes. Everything realigns. Upstream of the coma, the wind learns new manners. A bow-like structure may form where deceleration and heating accumulate. There the magnetic field strengthens and the flow tilts, beginning the drape. Downstream field lines slide past, connect, and sometimes break and reconnect, sending kinks that run along the ion tail like a pulse. The dust, heavier and deaf to magnetism, continues under radiation pressure, and gravity making a separate fan whose geometry carries the history of release, rather than the news of fields. One source, two tales, two conversations. He places a lesser-known detail gently where it can be seen: cometary X-rays, first noticed in the late 20th century, arise when highly charged ions from the solar wind steal electrons from neutral gas in the coma. The captured electrons drop into lower states and emit photons in the soft X-ray band, a quiet proof that charge exchange writes light, even where heat does not. X-rays from a sky colder than ice because particles carry stories temperature cannot tell. Closer to the nucleus, the field and the gas negotiate a different truce. Ionization and collisions pile up pressure until a contact surface, sometimes called a cometopause, separates solar wind plasma from comet-borne plasma. Within it, magnetic field lines drape so tightly that in the innermost region a diamagnetic cavity can open, where the magnetic field is nearly absent, its boundary held by currents in ionized gas that the comet itself exhaled. Spacecraft have crossed such cavities and found magnetic field strength drop to almost nothing in a volume carved by breath alone. The picture is steady outside field, inside neutral and slow ions, at the edge a current that holds the difference. The mystery that remains does not try to be large. It asks how the cavity's size flickers with rotation and jetting, how disconnection events when a tail seems to sever and reform time themselves against solar wind conditions and local chemistry, how microphysics of instabilities and waves born in the pickup of fresh ions cascade into structures that instruments taste but models still simplify. The big questions are already answered by structure. The small ones live in timing thresholds and texture. He sets 3 dry observations where the flow can carry them. They call it a shock, yet for many comets and many winds, the boundaries are more gradual curtains than walls, thick with transitions rather than breaks. They call the ion tail a single blade, yet it is braided with field line history, sometimes layered by episodes no eye can separate without a spectrograph. They call the dust tail the comet's trail, yet most dust never meets the nucleus again. Trail and travel apart immediately and forever. The heliosphere's weather complicates a clean diagram. The solar wind is not one wind, but many fast streams from coronal holes and slower streams from elsewhere intertwined and sheared. When a coronal mass ejection sweeps through the field, twists, compresses, and reconnects, and the comet's ion tail answers with bends and disconnections that seem like gestures and are only physics. Pressure rises, the contact surface shifts, the diamagnetic cavity shrinks or vanishes. Then as the storm passes, the structures return by the same small steps that left. This is not drama. It is a ledger of forces kept in moving plasma. Pick-up ions sing as they are born. Gyromotion around the magnetic field excites waves near their cyclotron frequencies, small oscillations that instruments record as if the plasma were humming a line about mass and charge. Those lines tell composition in directly heavier ions sing lower, lighter higher. The song fades with distance and time. Nearer the nucleus collisions damp it. Farther away expansion thins it into silence. Between there is a corridor where the coma makes music of a kind the ear cannot hear. The traveller never asks for this, the sun supplies it. In the neutral cloud that feeds all of this lifetimes are set by light. Water photo dissociates to OH in times of hours, OH to O in hours more. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide have their own schedules and daughters. Each step replaces neutral with ion at rates that rise with the sun and fall with distance, so the whole interaction region breathes with heliocentric distance and with rotation jetting more here, less there, recentering the comet's private weather under a public wind. The shapes that result are maps of time as much as space. Field lines like taut threads sometimes reconnect down the tail, pinching off sections that move away as if a kite string had snapped. Dust unfazed keeps to its gentle fan. Sodium, when present in sufficient numbers, draws a narrow solar-aligned emission that ignores both dust and field, and reminds the attentive that resonance scattering has its own rules. The section keeps its tone even as it names structures, because naming is calmer than announcing. Upstream region solar wind nearly pristine learning the coma. Pile-up field draped flow slowed pickup ions filling phase space. Contact surface mixing limited the comet's plasma predominant. Diamagnetic cavity field excluded neutrals ruling the pressure of their ions holding the edge. Downstream ion tail thin and taut, dust tail broad and slow. Each zone grades into the next without sharp borders unless the wind insists. A gentle analogy breathes once and stops the field drapes like silk over a stone. Not because the stone pulls it down, but because the wind that carries the silk must go around what it cannot pass through. He returns to the accepted fact because it deserves the last word. The ion tail follows the magnetic field carried by the solar wind, not the direction of motion. Orientation is a record of field, not of speed. That single sentence has rescued many misunderstandings. In images taken hours apart, the ion tail may swing even when the nucleus hardly moves. In images taken at the same hour from different longitudes, the dust tail's fan and the ion tail's line do not point together because they are answering different questions. Observer correct for phase angle, subtract sky align on the nucleus and watch the ion tail write the day's field while the dust carries a week's diary of release. The heliosphere imposes its cycle. Near solar minimum fields are smoother streams, more regular space weather quieter. Near maximum structure proliferates disconnections, frequent cavities jittery. The traveller does not know cycles, it answers conditions. The three small ironies stay visible a little longer before fading like waves. Only took a handful of ions born each second per cubic centimetre to slow a wind that crosses the solar system. Only required field lines drawn by a star to set the direction of a tail that belongs to a stone from elsewhere. Only needed sunlight that loosens one electron to turn a neutral river into a magnetized conversation kilometers wide and millions of kilometers long. In the innermost tens of kilometers, where molecules are still mostly neutral, trajectories are ballistic and gentle. Farther out, collisions thin and fields take command. Farther still, momentum exchange ends and the wind recovers its old speed, carrying with it a memory of the meeting in its softened field and lowered Mach number. If a spacecraft were to fly this gradient, its magnetometer would see the drape its ion instruments, the pickup ring distributions relaxing into shells its cameras, the tail as an emissive line against the dark. But even without a witness, the physics stands. He leaves one mystery in clear view as the section rests the precise choreography between nucleus rotation, jet source geography and cavity breathing. How each fault line on the surface to a fold in the fields and a pulse down the tail remains incompletely resolved for any single comet unless a mission lingers. For a one-passage traveller, inference replaces detail and detail returns to the night. The boundaries hold anyway, the wind flows anyway, the field drapes anyway. The traveller has met the sun's domain and been given a new set of rules to follow while inside it. Soon it will follow those rules back out through the same border, the drape easing the pickup, fading the ion tail, thinning into nothing that instruments can measure, and the dust fan becoming only a slow arc written on a chart no one keeps. The bubble ends. The medium resumes, the object continues. He stands closer to the stone now, close enough in thought to feel the arithmetic of warmth move through pores. Chemistry under an alien sun. Alien only because the traveller did not grow up here unfolds by balances, rather than by events. And the accepted fact at the centre is spare and sufficient as temperature rises. Different volatile ices sublimate at different thresholds, so outgassing becomes stratified in space and time, with water leading near the sun and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide contributing at larger distance and in shaded colder places. The surface is not a single switch, it is many small ones turning on and off under a rhythm set by rotation and by the slow change of heliocentric distance. Morning on the nucleus is a migration of isotherms across rough plains, ridges, pits, mantled slopes, where porosity holds vacuum and conducts heat so poorly that a day's warmth reaches only millimeters deep. That shallow skin depth means what matters most. Near the light frost on grains, ices in pores, thin crusts that crack when vapour pressure pushes from below. Outgassing starts in a whisper, molecules leaving walls and dragging dust, and the whisper grows until a tenuous weather fills the near-nucleus space. He lets a lesser-known detail take its place without emphasis, because ice-to-gas conversion consumes energy, sublimation. Cooling can shift the peak of outgassing away from the local noon, creating a diurnal phase lag, a late afternoon maximum that tells of thermal inertia and porosity as surely as any thermometer could. Instruments see the lag in the timing of jet brightness and in the slight bias of non-gravitational accelerations that nudge the orbit solution. Models fold it into a beaming parameter that stands in for roughness and heat storage, without naming a single boulder. The nucleus itself remains an inference wrapped in haze. Its reflectance is low darker than fresh asphalt, so absorbed sunlight warms efficiently. Its thermal inertia is modest, so nights fall sharply. Its shape, if elongated, makes mornings and evenings on some slopes long and fierce, while leaving other hollows in near-permanent twilight. Rotation couples everything. As the body turns active, regions enter and leave sunshine. Jets breathe with that cadence. Torque accumulates asymmetrically. The spin rate drifts. Moments change by micronewton meters writ across days. The consequences register as seconds added or subtracted from the period over weeks. Sometimes the axis precesses. Sometimes a season defined not by weather fronts, but by sun angle awakens a latitude band and puts another to sleep. The traveller teaches that seasons belong to any rotating body with a tilted axis and an orbit that brings changing light, even if that orbit will never repeat. He sets 3 dry observations down like small stones that later feet can feel without tripping. They call the jets violent, yet the pressures at the vent mouths are measured in pascals and the gas would barely stir dust on Earth. In near vacuum, those pascals are weather. They call the dust storm a storm, yet the grains drift at meters per second and write curves so slow the eye must be helped to notice them. In a coma drift is drama. They call the engine sunlight as if it were extravagant, yet the power per square meter at a few astronomical units is the gentle arithmetic that moves mountains of vapour, molecule by molecule. The chemistry follows rules that prefer patience to surprise. Water photo dissociates to hydroxyl, then to oxygen and hydrogen. Each step glows at wavelengths that observers learn by heart and then rehearse with calibration stars. Carbon dioxide dissociates and trades oxygen in the light. Carbon monoxide holds its line longer. Isotopes hide in tiny shifts and intensities. Deuterium in water asks for time and SN that most nights cannot give. Nitrogen's ratio sits inside CN with caveats about parentage. If detected at all, these fingerprints argue for ranges of formation temperature that would not shock a bourgeois, a disk. Modeler cold enough for water to freeze with heavier hydrogen modestly enriched. Cold enough for nitrogen to speak in an accent many comets share. The comet is an ordinary teacher, and that is why it matters. He leaves a mystery visible and sized to the data, the internal architecture, whether layers are segregated by volatility, whether voids interconnect like a sponge or break into pockets, whether an early irradiation crust covers a more volatile interior in a continuous cap or a patchwork remains unresolved for a 1 past-hour visitor seen only in remote light. Thermophysical models can match light curves and non-gravitational forces with families of shapes and vents. Radar would help and may not reach, direct imaging would answer, and will not arrive. The uncertainty is not a flaw, it is a boundary. Inside that boundary, diurnal and seasonal cycles write a slow diary. At dawn, rime sublimates off dust and frost blurs into vapour. At noon, pressure under a sintered mantle can lift a plug and send grains into the flow. In the evening, condensation paints shaded walls with a thin patina that will depart tomorrow. The day-night pump moves volatiles across centimetres across metres if fractures connect regions. Over weeks it shifts which areas contribute most gas-producing hysteresis between inbound and outbound light curves that inaugurates no drama and requires no metaphor. When the object stands nearer the sun, the coma thickens, lifetime's shortened scales contract. When it recedes, all of those reverse. Nothing votes, everything responds. The numbers that encircle this chemistry are modest and enough. Gas production rates climb by powers of heliocentric distance that vary with season and surface. Dust-to-gas ratios settle into values that say this nucleus is neither unusually dusty nor unusually clean. The polarization phase curve sketches grains that are irregular and rough with the familiar negative branch near small phase angles that only certain surface textures can produce. In thermal infrared, a smooth continuum lifts when silicate grains speak. The 10-micron feature may be a shoulder one night, a low hill, another rarely a peak telling of mixed mineralogies and sizes, rather than of purity anywhere. He allows a gentle analogy that harms nothing. The coma is like breath on cold morning air. The chemistry like the white that appears and vanishes, not because something new is made, but because conditions lift what is always ready to leave. Non-gravitational accelerations carry the consequences of that breath back into orbit solutions. A standard empirical law, sunlight in gas out, sets a frame. Fitted coefficients absorb all the particulars the law ignores. Jet geometry, thermal lags rotation states. The residuals trim themselves when parameters find their place. The path inches earlier or later to perihelion by minutes. The eccentricity and inclination budge by amounts that instruments can hear, but eyes cannot. A patient ledger turns this soft physics into small corrections people trust. He notes a lesser quiet piece that rarely reaches headlines' night side. Sublimation fed by lateral gas diffusion from sunlit pores, and by heat stored in rough interiors keeps activity from falling to zero, even when a site sits in darkness. In some geometries, night-side plumes answer mornings with a late echo that confuses simple models and enriches real ones. The surface is not a chessboard of on and off, it is a quilt of leaking seams. The heliosphere supplies context without stealing the scene. Field set ion tails, radiation pressure sorts dust, charge, exchange paints soft X-rays, pick up ions hum, but the heart of Section 9 rests on energy balances at the skin of a stone. Absorbed sunlight equals thermal emission plus latent heat. Bond albedo and emissivity decide the split. Roughness modifies both. Porosity chooses how far the calculation must go inward before stopping. Add rotation and vent geography, subtract nothing, and a weather appears that no barometer can hold. The ironies rise once more and recede. Only took a crust likely millimetres to centimetres thick to mediate between volatile reservoirs beneath and a sky millions of kilometres wide above. Only needed cracks the width of fingers to draw jets that curl across thousands of kilometres like chalk lines on air. Only required a change of a few tens of Kelvin to turn a quiet rock-dark plain into the source of a temporary atmosphere larger than any planet's mountain range. Perihelion approaches and will pass. The maximum of activity will occur not exactly at the closest distance, but close modulated by season and lag. Afterward, the same physics unwinds. Sublimation slows, condensates will reclaim walls, grains left near the surface cool and settle, fractures tighten, torque weakens, spindrift lessens. The non-gravitational terms relax back towards zero as distance rises and sunlight thins. Outbound light curves trace inbound ones imperfectly, the memory of altered surfaces making the way out slightly different from the way in. For a long-bound comet, this would matter for future apparitions. For a hyperbolic traveller, it writes a one-time asymmetry into a ledger that will not be reopened. He lets the section rest where measurement and modesty meet. The accepted process, stratified sublimation under changing sunlight, suffices to explain the coma's breathing and the tail's persistence. The lesser-known diurnal lag and nightside whisper take their small rightful place. The mystery of interior architecture remains honest and whole. The three ironies sit where they can be stepped over or contemplated. The nucleus turns, the sub-solar point crawls, pressure rises and falls in pores that were never meant for wind. Chemistry answers light the way frost answers morning, by leaving, by returning, by leaving again until distance puts everything back in storage and the traveller carries its weather inward on memory alone. He steps back just enough to let the eye become an instrument, because seeing is not simple light but light translated. Colours instruments translate, this is the quiet theme, and the accepted fact at the centre is sufficient, and small comet images are built from calibrated photons gathered through filters, then corrected, stacked, and sometimes mapped into false colour so that invisible physics can be seen. A telescope opens like a patient iris. Detectors count electrons released by photons. Each count passes through bias subtraction, dark correction, and flat fielding, and only after that arithmetic does the sky begin to tell. Stars in the field serve as anchors. Their catalogued magnitudes and colours pin the 0 points to common daylight. With those anchors in place, the comet's brightness becomes not a mood, but a number that holds across nights and instruments. Stacking extends faintness. Because the traveller moves while the stars remain, images aligned on the nucleus blur the stars into soft streaks. Aligned on the stars, the coma smears into a dim river. Both views teach and both are kept. In nucleus-aligned stacks, jets sharpen shells and fans emerge, and a scale that seemed too thin for touch becomes a map. In star-aligned stacks, the field becomes a fixed frame for measuring how brightness falls with radius. In either the point spread function, how the telescope and air turn a point into a soft hill, is the lens through which detail can be responsibly rescued. Deconvolution is attempted with care. Noise becomes art if pushed too hard, music becomes static if not enough is asked. He places a lesser-known detail carefully within this quiet craft, the opposition surge. A modest brightening at very small phase angles caused by shadow hiding and coherent backscatter in rough porous media can lift the dust coma's brightness by perceptible amounts. Measured well, that surge whispers about grain roughness and packing that no microscope will ever see. It is a subtle feature often lost to geometry and weather, and yet when present it turns phase into texture. Filters split roles. Broadband sets capture continuum light from dust and stars. Narrowband isolates emission from molecules CN, C2, C3, OH, so that gas and dust can be separated in maps that would otherwise confuse. Subtracting a scaled continuum frame from an emission frame leaves a clean image of where gas is strong. Subtracting an emission frame from a broadband frame leaves dust alone, pale and honest. In the dust-only map, isophotes and contours of equal brightness draw a faint topography. Asymmetries tell of jets. The sunward side often shows a bright rounded cap, while the anti-sunward side stretches as radiation pressure sorts grains into a slow fan. Rotational subtraction, subtracting a rotated copy of the coma from itself, can highlight jets by cancelling the near-symmetric background. The trick is old and useful and never the whole truth. Gentle false colour assigns blues to ion emission greens, to diatomic carbon reds to dust continuum, not to deceive but to separate to give the eye a handle on what physics already knows. He allows a gentle analogy that does not instruct so much as clarify false colour, is a translation between languages that the ear cannot hear, not a costume. Photometry turns images into ledgers. Apertures of fixed physical size at the comet adjusted for distance with each night collect light that becomes apparent magnitude, then reduced magnitude after phase and geometry correction. Surface brightness profiles plotted against radius let dust production be inferred with simple models or their more careful heirs. Breaks in slope mark transitions from near-nucleus physics to radiation pressure fields. AFR spare and serviceable becomes a single value that summarizes how much dust reflects within a reference cylinder of space. It is not the dust only a proxy, and yet its steadiness across instruments makes it a good sentence among many. 3 dry observations step out of the images without any need to raise their voices. They call such portraits photographs as if they were moments, yet each is the sum of minutes and sometimes hours, a time-smooth chord rather than a note. They call the colours real, though many are chosen to reveal not to resemble. Reality here is the wavelength, not the hue the eye is given. They call the nucleus seen when the core looks point-like, though the point is the instrument, not the stone. The stone remains veiled, its presence inferred from shape more than sight. Geometry rules what mood pretends to cause. Phase angle governs forward scattering, so near-sun alignments lift dust brightness with a grace that asks for no story. Large phase angles favour side-scattered light and draw halos the eye reads as thinner. Small angles invite the opposition surge to soften the centre. The tail points not where the comet moves, but where sunlight and fields command dust, anti-sunward with the lag, ions down the magnetic field lines carried by the solar wind. With good cadence, a kink in the ion tail moves as a record of field realignment rather than as a cometary shiver. With good subtraction, a sodium tail, if present, stands like a needle aligned with sunlight, narrow and strange. In thermal infrared, the coma glows with heat borrowed from the sun and returned. Grains near 10 micrometers speak with silicate voices. Space-based images free of atmospheric water bands measure that glow without the sky's quiver. In ultraviolet, OH arcs interview as water's proxy bands the atmosphere on Earth, filters and space telescopes translate. Radar, when distances and sizes permit, sees grains and geometry rather than light, but for small one-pass visitors, radar usually watches silence. Its discipline persists even when the comet does not answer. He leaves a small honest mystery in the centre of the frame. The nucleus shape, rotation, state and vent geography remain unresolved in images built at planetary distances. Coma morphologies suggest sources. Light curves hint at periods. Non-gravitational terms whisper talks. But the actual map of pits and cliffs and rifts belongs to a surface that will not be drawn this time. Models can recreate a family of shapes that would produce the observed jets under certain spin axes, and more than one family fits. That is not failure. That is the honest resolution of light travelling too far through air and space to draw a cliff's sharp edge. Processing itself becomes part of the portrait. Background subtraction must remove sky without removing coma. Flat fields must divide vignetting without multiplying noise. Cosmic rays must be identified and interpolated without touching stars or jets. The best reductions look like nothing at all. Quiet images with structure that does not announce the work beneath. Catalogue cross-matching grounds positions in a frame where orbits can be measured to tenths of an arcsecond and then to hundredths. Time stamps tie photons to absolute minutes so that rotation can be felt without touching the stone. Isophoties once traced by hand now flow from software, yet the discipline remains the same. Never ask more of a frame than its seeing and scale can give. He returns to colour because colour is a question. Why does the coma skew red in broadband? Because grains are large enough to prefer longer wavelengths, and because organics darken and tilt reflectance. Why do narrowband frames feel like maps of weather? Because molecules are born and die on timescales that are hours, not days, and their distributions follow lifetimes as well as winds. Why does the core glow green to an amateur camera? Because C2 responds strongly while the eye is too insensitive to separate emissions. So the camera's sensor and processing pipeline turn physics into a hue. Human language calls green. None of this deceives when named. All of it misleads when left alone without captions. Two further details, gentle but firm, keep the ledger full. First, absolute calibration rests on standard stars whose spectral energy distributions serve as rulers. Without them, images become anecdotes. Second, seeing the atmosphere's restless focus sets the smallest scale that can be trusted. Deconvolution can polish, not create detail. Over-sharpening raises ghosts as confident as anything real. The section's rhythm returns to patience as perihelion nears or passes. Nearer the sun, shorter exposures suffice. Motion grows. The trade between blur and faintness becomes more delicate. Outbound the coma thins, stacking longer and more often buys back what distance takes. Quieter nights become more valuable than bigger mirrors. Cadence replaces aperture as the king of certain questions. The ironies take their place and pass. Only took turning sky into numbers to see that colour is a calculation. Only needed to blur stars into streaks to make a moving haze sharp. Only required assigning false blues and reds to reveal gases no eye can see, so that truth arrives by an invented hue. He lets images conclude by returning to what they actually are. Integrations, translations, compromises. They are not the comet, they are the way light from the comet is organized so that minds can read it. They hold information about dust-sized distributions in their slopes, about gas lifetimes in their contrasts, about field lines in the ion tails line, about rotation in the repeating fans that only appear if one cares to look night after night. They do not hold the smell of the dust, the feel of the pores, the shape of the boulder that shadows one vent. For that a spacecraft would have to hover, and for this traveller there will be none. The accepted fact stays where he placed it at the start. Photons gathered through filters and turned into calibrated images are how seeing becomes knowing. The lesser-known opposition surge remains a note about roughness that only some geometries permit. The mystery of the nucleus's true relief keeps its place in the centre behind a veil the images acknowledge rather than pierce. The three ironies fade like stars in a dawn that is only data. The colours, having said what physics asked them to say, return to quiet, and the comet continues without noticing that it has been seen. He arrives with the curve at its nearest turn. A closeness felt more by numbers than by heat, because even at perihelion space is roomy. The accepted fact rests first, and steady the comet reaches perihelion, the point of minimum distance from the sun when its true anomaly is zero, a geometric instant when inward ceases and outward begins, and for many comets that instant hides in glare too bright for ordinary telescopes to see. Geometry, not drama, places the visitor behind brightness. Solar elongation dwindles. The comet approaches the sun's face as seen from Earth. Scattered light in Earth's own sky rises. Sensitive instruments step aside. For a while, ground-based observers can only listen with coronagraphs that make artificial eclipses, or they wait through daylight and proximity until dusk returns the darkness. The traveller does not wait. Insolation peaks, sublimation rates crest, gas and dust production respond with bags that belong to pores, not to clocks. If forward scattering lines up, if sun, dust and observer form a near straight, the coma brightens in a quiet surge, not because it changes, but because geometry prefers small angles. Then the alignment loosens and the same dust returns to its former diffidence. He lets a lesser-known detail take its small seat near perihelion. Thermal stresses can fracture sunlit crusts on our timescales, creating jets not from new chemistry but from new paths. These thermal shock events sometimes masquerade as outbursts, yet their signature is a sudden directional plume that fades as quickly as it formed. In models, a tensile strength measured in tens to hundreds of pascals is enough to hold a cap until it isn't. In light curves, the distinction is a brief bump on a slope already rising. Perihelion is not a point in experience, it is a region. The nucleus rotates through hours when the subsolar point creeps across relief tracing lines of warmth and shadow that chemistry follows like punctuation. Diurnal lags push activity peaks into the afternoon. Nightside diffusion keeps the dark from falling silent. Seasonal tilt shifts which latitudes contribute most. The instantaneous nearest approach is a tidy mark on an ephemeris and a blur in the coma's life. He sets 3 dry observations where they can rest and be true. They call it closest to the sun, yet the distance remains a gulf that light crosses in minutes and matter never crosses at all. They call it lost in the glare, though coronagraphs and spacecraft watch plainly turning noon into eclipse and seeing what the eye cannot. They call it the moment of maximum activity, yet the maximum often drifts to one side because surfaces and seasons answer warmth with lags, not with obedience. In instruments that can keep the sun off the sensor, the physics writes quietly. Coronagraphs at the Sun-Earth line subtract the star and reveal a thin halo and a narrow straight ion tail that pivots with the interplanetary magnetic field. Dust nearer the sun under stronger radiation pressure arcs into a sunward cap and an anti-sunward fan. Sodium, if abundant enough, makes a needle on the sunlight line that ignores both field and inertia. Ion tail disconnection events common in unsettled solar wind step down the tail like knots released. Each is a reconnection written in kilometers and minutes, a field story told in neutral light. The nucleus remains hidden in all of this, a compact black take-up reel behind the bright cloth. The mystery that remains is proportion to patience how much of the activity near perihelion comes from fresh cracks versus matured vents. How much torque those episodes contribute to the spin. Whether the period wanders by measurable seconds in days or only by hints that fold into residuals. Without a spacecraft lingering nearby, the ledger can only infer. It is enough and it is not everything. Non-gravitational forces speak here in clearer voices than earlier. Sublimating gas leaves with momentum and imparts the opposite to the nucleus. Asymmetry in time around perihelion more thrust inbound than outbound, or the reverse shifts the orbit's elements by amounts small to any eye and solid to any solution. Perihelion time slides by minutes. The argument of perihelion nudges. The inclination tilts by the angles measured in arc seconds. The eccentricity breathes. Analysts fit empirical laws that weight sunlight by distance and fold roughness, spin, and vent longitudes into a few coefficients. The fit improves. The path becomes a sentence with fewer typos. He allows a gentle analogy that causes no harm. Perihelion is a lever pressed by light. The handle is long and the motion small, and yet over the arc of the curve it matters enough for instruments to agree. Thermal physics keeps to its measured keys. Absorbed power splits into thermal emission and latent heat. Emissivity decides how quickly warmth becomes infrared. Albedo decides how much never becomes warmth at all. Roughness modifies both by trapping light in microcavities. Porosity decides how far into the body any of that can reach. With each rotation, the subsolar point paints stripes that fade with depth, and the thickness of those stripes, the diurnal skin depth, remains on the order of millimeters to centimeters. It is this thinness that makes perihelion a surface event felt in veneers and cracks hardly at all in cause. If a dust mantle thickens where gas escapes, most vents migrate. If sintering strengthens, a cap pressure rises beneath. If fractures link layers, distant ice contributes to a local jet, and the light curve's logic includes a path invisible to any camera. He does not tidy these complexities. He lets them be the texture the data deserves. Forward scattering peaks when the phase angle is small. At perihelion, the geometry sometimes denies that peak to Earth-based observers and sometimes grants it. When it grants the brightening, can mislead an elastic lift on a curve that observers correct and then discuss anyway, because the eye remembers better than the ledger. Side scattering at larger phase angles removes that lift. The coma looks thinner even if production is higher. Phase functions exist to remind us that mood is not measure. The dust's colour remains a pale red steeper inbound if grains are fresher. Outbound processing and lost tilt slopes. The 10-micron silicate shoulder may be slightly stronger near perihelion if temperatures and sizes align. Often it simply persists indifferent to our interest. Ion tails sharp and electric register the day's field. Dust tails, broad and quiet, register the week's release. Both are honest. He places 3 more quiet ironies like flat stones near water. Only took a change of a few tens of Kelvin to turn distant inert pores into the loudest hour they will ever have, and still no one nearby could feel a wind. Only required subtracting the sun from the sky to find that the comet never disappeared, the disappearance belonging to our instruments, not to the thing itself. Only needed minutes of true anomaly around zero to earn a chapter that takes hours to read because everything near it lags. The sun's own weather writes through this passage. Fast and slow streams meet. Compression strengthens fields. Reconnection loosens them again. Coronal mass ejections pass like soft hammer blows. The comet's plasma boundaries respond with shrinking swelling and disconnections that make movies in coronagraphs. None of it leaves a mark on the stone deeper than a whisper in parameters. All of it leaves a mark on the tail written in angles and lengths. Perihelion is a classroom for the wind as much as for the traveller. Down on Earth, schedules flow around the glare. Morning and evening elongations open and close windows that dictate where telescopes can point. Southern and northern hemispheres take turns. Some observatories hand the object from dusk to dawn across longitudes like a careful relay. Others wait the gap. Spacecraft nonchalantly ignore weather and see the same event as a continuous thread. The comet experiences neither gap nor relay. It experiences sunlight at a distance that changes smoothly and then changes back. He lets one more small lesser-known note be heard. Sodium emission narrow, and solar aligned sometimes strengthens near perihelion as thermal release from grains and surfaces contributes. It betrays a metal's participation in what most people call ice, and it fades outbound as quickly as it came. The nucleus continues to turn. If torques mount the period slips, if they surmount enough and the body's small rotational stresses may exceed tensile strength and a lobe may shed or a fragment may carve, that is a possibility, not a prediction. In this passage the mystery remains, a line with no figure does the period change measurably. Do vents migrate? Is there a discrete break or only rearrangement under stress? The light curve will answer with hints, the orbit with decimals. Out of glare, the traveller returns to ordinary darkness. Solar elongation grows, twilight yields, telescopes regain their balance of sky and stone. The coma past its crest remains abundant. The dust fan thickens where trajectories pile up. The Asian tail thins if the wind calms. Afar finds its outbound slope, the opposition surge. If geometry permits, pays a brief second visit at small phase angles, then leaves. The ephemeris clocks the instant of perihelion and moves on. The comet lingers in a time that is not made of instants. He closes the section by allowing the geometry to have the last word and the mood to follow it. Perihelion is an angle 0 in a coordinate the traveller does not know, yet the physics it gathers is local and textured pores. Gas out, crusts crack, fields, drape tails respond, and a small shift in orbital elements writes down what breath accomplished. Closest is still far. Brightest is often a trick of alignment. Fastest because speed is greatest near perihelion. Feels slow because the sky is large and the mind's scale is small. The curve bends and releases. The object continues outward, now teaching the same lesson with reversed signs and altered surfaces, that sunlight geometry and material are enough to make weather on a stone, to draw lines across a vacuum, and to write a chapter under a glare that belongs to us, not to space. He lets distance do the calming, because distance is the most reliable safety there is. The accepted fact sits quiet and complete. The comet's hyperbolic path keeps it far from Earth, missing our planet by a wide, unremarkable margin that ephemerides have shown from the first reliable solutions and continue to show as data sharpen. No encounter, no close past, no need for new words. The geometry is content to be ordinary. Minimum orbit intersection distance. Moid stays large. Geocentric distance traces a slow rise and fall that never nudges alarm. The object's motion across the sky is measured in arc minutes per hour, at most often less a patient glide that telescopes love and headlines ignore. The night sky in return gives it room. Solar elongation opens after perihelion. Twilight ceases to drown it. The field steadies. Observers collect nights enough to turn single frames into curves. The lesser-known detail belongs to parallax and to the craft of measurement, because the traveller is both near enough for baseline to matter and far enough for lines to be thin. Simultaneous observations from sites separated by continents can triangulate position to tens of kilometres, pulling ephemerides even tighter and showing at human scale the grace of geodesy applied to a moving haze. With that triangulation residuals that once drifted firm into a line. With that line, prediction becomes a simple courtesy rather than a feat. He leaves the numbers unspoken and lets the method stand 2 horizons, 1 sky, a shared object, and a separation big enough to turn angle into distance. The path is a safe remove, and that safety has texture. As geocentric distance grows